Good morning and welcome to the 11th meeting of 2022 of the Economy and Fair Work Committee. Our first item of business is a decision to take item 4 in private. Are members content to do so?
Agreed.
Good. So our next item of business continues our evidence gathering for the town centre and retail inquiry. The focus today is on the new realities for the Scottish retail sector. The committee will hear evidence from 2 panels, and I welcome our first panel, Paul Gerrard, Campaigns and Public Affairs Director from the Co-op Group, David Lonsdale, Director of the Scottish Retail Consortium, Martin Newman, a member of KMPG, Ipsos Retail Think Tank, and Maxine Smedley, who is Head of Stores Scotland for Boots. Thank you for attending this morning. As always, if members and witnesses could keep their questions and answers as concise as possible. I'll say that not every question will be directed to every panel member, but everyone will have an opportunity to contribute. If I could maybe start the questions. And first of all, if maybe direct the first question to Paul and Maxine. I come to Paul. First of all, the retail sector has had a difficult time during the pandemic, and as we start to emerge from COVID, what do you see as being the main concerns for retail sectors? How has the experience been, and how is the recovery? If you want to go first, Paul.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to give evidence to the committee. The Co-op Group's a UK-wide business, but we have a bigger presence in Scotland proportionately. 15% of our stores are in Scotland, and I think we're probably more important in Scotland to many Scottish communities than we are in other parts of the UK. 11 of our 12 Lifeline stores are in Scotland. 20% of our stores in Scotland are the only food retailer in a community. And I think during the pandemic, the importance of the Co-op Group stores, and indeed other Co-op stores like Scott Mid, became really clear, because we were the only places that people could get food, and often the only places people could shop. So I think the importance of the Co-op and food stores like the Co-op, like Scott Mid, were really important. I think 3 challenges as we come out of the pandemic that I think we are very focused on, and they apply in Scotland. Firstly, online has clearly grown significantly. If I look at our own online business across the UK, we had a very small online presence in 2019, about £4 million worth. That's now £200 million worth of business across the UK in 2021. But online has grown, and I think will continue to grow. And how that is delivered depends, and in Scotland it is a really varied model of delivery, but online I think is important. I think secondly, there are burdens on businesses that, if we are not careful, will prevent us investing in communities and in stores and in colleagues. Rates is the most obvious example of that. And I think the third thing I would say is, as we think about online and then we think about the burdens on businesses, the importance of bricks and mortar shops to communities was never more seen than during COVID. And I think we have to be really careful and tread carefully in how we support both the growth of online, but also protect those anchor institutions, which is what retail stores very often are. As I said before, 20% of the Co-op Group stores in Scotland are the only food retailer in a community. If I compare it to the rest of the UK, it's significantly higher. So I think how we balance the ease of online with the importance of physical shops to communities, I think is really important. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Maxine, would you like to respond to that question? We did actually have a round table this week in Dumfries, and one of your store managers attended, so she did give us some insight into Boots' experience during COVID. But do you want to maybe say a wee bit about the retail sector and the recovery?
Yes, of course. Good morning, everybody. I think I'd add to what Paul has described here. So similarly, Boots are in every high street and every town centre in Scotland. We have 274 stores across Scotland, ranging from our smallest store to our biggest flagship stores. And I think in relation to the pandemic, we were open throughout as an essential retailer because of our pharmacy business. And it's clear to see the impact that the pandemic has had, has definitely accelerated changes that we saw happening beforehand. So Town centres are really important to us. We know that it's a big part of our future. However, we have saw customers diverge away from town centres, particularly during the pandemic, where they sought open spaces and out of town retail. That hasn't all returned to town centres, and certainly we do see the impact, particularly in our largest city centres, so Glasgow, Edinburgh, where previously we would have also benefited from a lot of office workers and a lot of the kind of work population. However, we do continue to bounce back. We have sustained growth in our last quarter. We were up 22% versus Q2. However, what we're really seeing is a need to diversify our business. So where we previously would have had a fairly or less experiential model, we now have moved into providing a more experiential beauty model, a more experiential healthcare model, and that's definitely fitting the needs of our customers. We're seeing a real extrapolation between value and premium. So we have a lot of our core customers who their spending is obviously much diminished, and therefore the value proposition is really important to them. But then conversely, we do see people who have not had opportunities to spend their free income, and we see an impact on that. I think, just to touch on some of the points, we do see that larger retailers are subject to higher property supplement, and it's clear to see in some of our locations we are overspaced. And we have tried to really take advantage of that, particularly with online growth. So during the pandemic, we saw some of our businesses change to being almost online warehouses. And that has really protected jobs, and it's really helped to diversify the stores that we have. But I think going forward, what we really need is we need to make our customers more confident. So consumer confidence is really important to us at the moment, particularly in our high street locations. If we could have anything that stimulates consumer confidence, that would really make a difference for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maxine. David, if I could come to you. So I kind of follow on to that question because Maxine Maxine and Paul have both talked about a shared experience of. So I think the committee are kind of familiar with the big issues that have arisen from COVID and the struggles of retail. The government have recently published the strategy for the retail sector. Have you had a chance to look at the strategy? Do you think they've chosen the right areas to focus on to aid recovery and help support the sector?
So, firstly, thank you for the invitation to be here. It's lovely to be in person at a real live meeting as well, which is great. So, yes, we've had a look at the retail strategy. We've also had a look at some of the other, if you like, parallel strategies that have been published in recent weeks. There was one on city centre recovery, and obviously a couple of weeks ago, there was the one on town centres, the joint one between the Scottish Government and COSLA. So, I mean, one of our big asks over recent years has been around policy coherence. And actually, we think that a lot of the building blocks are now in place. I guess the one sort of outstanding area that hasn't been addressed in these different strategies, and I think Paul and Maxine have touched on it, is this whole issue around the cost of doing business. And that's obviously very much to the fore at the moment in terms of business costs, but also the cost of living affecting households as well. So a lot of positives. I'm happy to go into the detail of the retail strategy. I suppose in terms of costs and business rates, I think ministers were very clear process that they wouldn't be addressing the issue of non-domestic rates, for example, in terms of the retail strategy. But certainly there was a lot in there we supported. There was a very prominent an upbeat recognition about the social and economic contribution of the sector. In Scotland, there's a strong element to collaboration between government and industry, which is good. It's something that I'm conscious there are former ministers on this committee will know some of the discussions we've had over the piece, so that's positive. And issues like the journey to net zero, actually the industry's got quite a good story to tell on this. We published a net zero by 2040 roadmap about 18-20 months ago. And so the retail strategy is really about how can we get more retailers to participate in that. So we're up for that. We're already doing a lot in that space to help our members and retailers on that journey.
The retail by its name, it is a strategy. It is setting longer-term ambitions. Is enough being done to respond to the immediate pressures being faced by the retail sector? We were in Dumfries on Monday, and while there was a positive story there in terms of the mid-steeple quarter, like many high streets, it did have large empty vacant units that was struggling to be let again. We heard on the radio this morning about rising costs for businesses, the energy costs going up at such a fast rate. Is there enough being done to support businesses with the shorter term pressures that they're facing?
Yeah, I mean, so the first thing to say is that obviously in the last 2 years there's been very substantial and swift support from government to aid the business community and retail in particular to get through the COVID crisis. And obviously, you know, one of the points we've been making is that retailers are more than happy to pay their fair share of taxes and do that. Obviously, business rates have been reinstated, for example, at the beginning of this month. They've been reinstated at a 23-year high. So I think that's worth pointing out. And obviously, in our written submission, we put forward some suggestions about how that could be addressed. We've also been quite clear about the need for some short-term actions to stimulate the return, if you like, of commuters and office workers to our city centres, to bring in tourists, to try and get the footfall back up. We monitor a suite of surveys and data on retail sales, on empty units, empty retail premises, on shopper footfall. And while retail sales last month for the first time got back up to pre-pandemic levels, shopper footfall is still well short of that. Obviously, with Easter and tourists coming back, and I noticed this morning the train seemed full coming in from Stirling, so that was quite positive. But I still think there's going to be an issue there, because I think for the reasons to do with the cost of living and other factors, then there is a real question mark as to how sustainable that demand, that return of demand, will be over the months ahead.
Thank you, David. I'm now going to bring in Colin Smith to be followed by Jamie Halker-Johnson.
Thanks very much, Convener, and good morning to the panel. We took evidence recently from Professor Lee Sparks, and one of the quotes he used was, "We have spent at least 50 years damaging our town centres," and I wonder if the panel agreed with that, and I suppose more importantly, how do you think that can be reversed? And I appreciate you've touched on some of those ideas already, but any other ideas you have and how we reverse that, and do you agree with Professor Sparks' commentary about that, what we've done over the last 50 years? And I can kick off with maybe bringing in Martin Newman to start the discussion.
First of all, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to contribute to the conversation this morning. I think we have. I think there's a number of factors at play, and I think there's a number of things that we need to look at addressing in order to create an environment that consumers actually want to spend time in. So I don't think, you know, if we think back to what retail and what the high streets used to be about, it did just used to be about shops. It was a very transactional relationship. So I think, first of all, retail has to up its game. I think the experience in retail environments has to become a bit more experiential than it's been previously. I think one of the positives that I would say is, if you look at what's happening with housing, whereby historically we've moved out to the suburbs, with the increase in single dwellings, more and more people want to live in and around our town centres. So we're going to see population moving back in to near where our retail stores are. But the experience has to be better. But then we also need a better mix. So we look at all these empty spaces on our high streets at the moment. These shouldn't just be retail stores. We need to have entertainment. We need to have the right mix of food and beverage. We need to make parking accessible, or give consumers the ability to get into these town centres in a more cost-effective way. So I think the environment has to be better. The mix of experience has to be better. And I think that, given, as I say, what's happening with the population trend, we should be quite confident about what the future looks like. And if you want to have a look at just one brand, have a think about what's maybe changing, you look at IKEA. You know, IKEA have announced recently they're closing their big out-of-town centre in Edmonton and Tottenham in London. They've taken the old Topshop store in Oxford Circus. So IKEA are saying we want to be closer to where our customers are, and we see that being in town centres. So I think there's a real opportunity to encourage some bigger retailers that possibly even previously didn't used to, take up spaces on our high street, to be there where customers are. But we need to create better environments.
Can I just follow that point up with yourself, David? So, Martin's saying that bigger retailers, many of your members, I suppose, are now more interested in the high street. Is that something that you're seeing? Or are you still, we've spent a lot of time allowing out-of-town developments to take place, which have had arguably a devastating impact on the town centre. Are you seeing members taking an interest again in the town centre, wanting to reverse that? Or do we have to take further action, I suppose, to stop these out-of-town developments again?
So we have a large number of members, and they tend to be larger retailers, although we have a number of smaller retailers in membership and if you like, subsectoral trade associations that represent smaller retailers in our membership. And the diverse nature of the industry is they often have a footfall or a stake in different retail destinations, whether that's town centres, city centres, online, out-of-town retail parks, shopping centres, and all the rest of it. But what they want to see is retail destinations that are healthy, vibrant, have a sort of successful ecosystem of different types of businesses and lots of reasons for people to visit. So quite often on my travels going out to see members, I'll ask them, what type of destinations are you, what are the best destinations? And they often reel off, if you like, the obvious places in Scotland where, there are reasons for people to go and visit, whether that's, the Merchant City in Glasgow because of high-end fashion in the Italian Centre, etc., or places like Edinburgh, St Andrews, or Nairn, or Peebles, or Oban, or Fort William, where they've got obvious particular sort of niches covered, whether that's, outdoor activity or tourist destinations and things like that. So most of our retailers have a stake in these areas. They want them to be successful. Those areas that have, if you like, a little bit more money, they might be more affluent. Their tourist destinations or market towns tend to be the areas that are particularly good for retailers. In terms of your question about damaging town centres and Professor Sparks' comments, I think there's a whole range of issues that predate COVID for some of the challenges that town centres face. So that can be the rise of car ownership. We saw supermarkets move from food into non-food many years ago as well. Out-of-town developments being consented by councils for very understandable reasons as well. So there's a whole range of factors in that. Obviously, the rise of online. I guess, you mentioned Professor Sparks mentioned that he chaired the review of the Town Centres Action Plan that I reported early last year, and that's what COSLA ministers responded to a couple of weeks ago. And I had a reacquainted myself with Professor Sparks' review before coming along today, and it was quite interesting because it actually is explicit in saying that the cost of doing business in town centres is too high, it's too expensive, and that restricted economic activity. So I think that's one for the committee to bear in mind.
I think I remember we'll come in and talk about business rates quite soon, which I know you have strong views on. But can I bring Maxine in? Maxine, you made a point earlier, and obviously feel free to comment on what Lee Sparks says, but you made a point earlier about how you need action, I suppose, to stimulate consumers back into the high street. What type of action would you like to see take place?
I think Martin brought it to life quite well. So our town centres, there is no one size fits all in terms of our town centres. As David said, as a big retailer, we have representation on out of town, we have representation small communities and town centres as well. I think I'd use an example to try and draw or bring to life what would help, and that would be shopping centres. So privately owned shopping centres obviously are commercial businesses, but they do very well in terms of increasing the dwell time for consumers. So that kind of multi-centre inclusive approach to retail, hospitality, leisure, in some cases residential. All of those things really help to increase the dwell time, but also attract our consumers. We're definitely still seeing a trend of consumers visiting less often, and anything that encourages them to come out of the house and actually spend some time in those locations. I think the other thing that's really important in considering our town centres going forward is how we look at the digital accessibility. We know certainly both with the growth in online sales, but there's definitely an omni-channel approach to things. People want to look at reviews, etc., whilst they're shopping. So digital infrastructure in town centres is really important. And I think the other thing, I did allude to town centre locations in terms of office workers, but we know the hybrid way of working will stay. So anything that will at least encourage people to spend part of their working day in a town centre. So flexible working spaces, as an example, would really help to bring people in a different way that we haven't thought of in the past.
That's very helpful. Could I bring, excuse me, can I bring Paul in now? You've obviously talked about how ScotMid, I suppose, weathered the pandemic storm and actually in many ways delivered in our town centres. What would help to ensure that continues?
I think for the Court Group and indeed our friends at ScotMid, I think a couple of things I would say. I would agree very much with Martin about as food stores, we need to be close to our customers. And as Maxine said, that's not one size fits all. So for, you know, city centre stuff, it might be around office workers, commuters. If it's in tourist, and we have a very big tourist focused business, it will be a slightly different fit. For those where we're the main store in the community, slightly different fit. So I think we need to be closer to our customers and members. That's absolutely true. In order to do that, what we do know is that where we can invest in those stores and make sure that those stores provide services to our customers and our members, that's when they become successful, and that's when they become real anchor institutions. And I know you mentioned that, and I'm sure we'll come on to it. The rate system, but other things as well, do not incentivise investment into stores to increase their value to communities and to town centres. That is a fact. We, you know, as David said, retailers are very happy. Here at the Court Group, we're very happy to pay our fair share. Indeed, we hold the fair tax mark. But it's also about fairness. And it's about our ability to invest in those stores, in our colleagues and in the communities, so that they become really vibrant anchor institutions within communities.
Okay, thank you. Jamie Harker's on to be followed by Maggie Chapman. Can I remind MSPs you don't have to address the question to every panel member. If you want to name the panel member, that would help us complete this in time. Thank you.
I feel that's me, duly warned, convener. Morning to the panel. I know we've obviously heard there's no one size fits all, and you know, I'm represent the Highlands and Islands, and every community is different. But I would like to ask, perhaps direct it to Martin Newman and then to David, a fairly general question, which is, what does a successful town centre look like now? What examples across the UK are there? And also, what will it look like in, say, 20 years? And are there particular examples that you feel is on a particular UK or Scottish examples that are on that path to, you know, to making the kind of necessary improvements? So if I can put that to Martin first and then to David.
Thank you. It's hard to find any perfect examples at the moment, because I think obviously we're in this stage of evolution where, you know, lots of our high streets still have sadly empty spaces. But to paint a picture of what I think it needs to look like and where we're going, Maxine made a good point about the omni-channel proposition. And think about the best way to think of this, I think, is to think of the fact that consumers are empowered. The internet took the power away to some extent from retailers and put it in the hands of the consumers. Because if we have a bad experience in physical retail, we've got 10,000 choices immediately available online, right? So if we understand that, and we understand how people shop, which is we go online for for convenience, but we still like to enjoy a good experience, then again, to Maxine's point, anything we can do to increase dwell time and to create an environment that people want to spend time in. And that's how I think we have to think of our high street. And just having retail stores is not enough. We need the right mix of retail stores, work environments, you know, flexible working, opportunity, food and beverage, hospitality, entertainment, the things that will bring people in because they want to spend time there. If they don't want to spend time there, then they'll just go online. And of course, we've also got the rise of this thing called the metaverse that we'll probably talk about another time, which is essentially the virtual equivalent of the physical world in the online world, right? So that's something else that's going to come down the line. So I think that we've got to create environments, and I think that needs yourselves, it needs, you know, a government level, at a local authority level, retailers, landlords, consumers. You know, we need a conglomerate of entities to come together to work out what sort of environment do we need to create that's going to be relevant, you know, both in the short term and in the longer term, but pays account of the fact of how consumer behaviour is changing. As I said, on a positive note, I definitely envisage that more and more people will be living in and around town centres. So the addressable market for retailers is going to actually increase in the future because there's going to be more people living in and around their stores and where they're actually going to be. And I think the more we can do to encourage landlords to, for example, you know, leases used to be tied to, retailers used to be tied into ridiculously onerous leases over 10 or 20 years, very expensive. We now need turnover-based leases, leases that reflect the profitability and the turnover of a store, which gives somebody a better opportunity to actually make money out of that store and not be tied into something that essentially is a noose around their neck. And if we can do something with business rates, and I know we'll go on and talk about that, then again, to the points made earlier, I think by both David and Paul, we create, from a cost point of view, a model that's a profit and loss model that's more attractive to retailers where they can run stores efficiently and profitably.
Thanks. David.
I'll defer to Martin on the metaverse, if I may, convener, but I think he touches on most of the correct points about, you know, people are living there in towns. There's good reasons to go and visit. There's, as I said earlier on, there's an ecosystem that is mutually reinforcing and beneficial to shops, whether that's hospitality, culture, leisure, other reasons to be there. Just maybe to add a couple of points over and above things like tax and parking and transport links that have already been made. I mean, this sounds incredibly dry, but even things like building standards in the planning system, as I understand it, this is not my area of expertise, but what members tell me is, for example, they can get shops up trading more quickly south of the border than they can in Scotland, because they can, when they're applying for a building warrant down south, as I understand it, they can crack on with the work. They can even approach their own, they can actually choose who they want to verify their building control or building standards, whereas in Scotland you need a warrant in your hand first before you can get somebody in either to do the work to open a new store or to make substantial refurbishments or to put in, you know, signage or toilets or new seating or something like that. So there are some, if you like, low-level practical things I think could be looked at by this committee or recommended for further investigation that could be done going forward. In terms of successful places, I think I've touched on it in terms of, you know, destinations, really good reasons for people to go and visit. Obviously, there are some structural benefits if an area has a sort of affluent catchment area as well. So obviously, if we can get the economy motoring and a more buoyant economy, then retail should be lifted by that naturally as well. But I think there are a number of policy levers that can be pulled that can make a positive difference to that. And obviously, we've tried to articulate that in our submission to the committee.
Okay, thanks very much. If I can come back to Martin then briefly on, you know, we've heard a lot about the shift to online retail. At the beginning of the pandemic, there were a lot of small businesses that weren't online, quickly had to come online, but offering the kind of delivery at the same, you know, the same kind of timescales, you know, 3 to 5 working days, etc. We've seen, you know, a real increase in almost instantaneous app-based delivery for, you know, smaller superstores. You know, it could be with you in 40 minutes. Firstly, do you think that's likely to be an opportunity for smaller retailers on the high street to boost and support their online sales, which will maybe help keep them on the high street? And also on a wider point as well, we talk about empty stores. Do we have too many shops in our high streets? Do we have too many retail spaces? Are we going to need to see almost a reduction and a focus on certain shopping streets in communities across? Is that something that you can see kind of going forward?
Okay, great questions. I'll take the second one first. I think that, you know, I think we do need to think about the mix of retail proposition. It's not necessarily that we have too many stores. Again, it's about creating an environment that really pulls people in. If it's only retail stores, I'd argue that's not going to be enough. We need the right mix of food and beverage and entertainment and hospitality and everything to go alongside that. And whilst, you know, I'm on the board of a charity and I'm all for the charity sector, you know, what you tend to find is when you look at a lot of high streets with lots of empty spaces, you know, they do tend to be often taken up by plethora of charity stores. And that in itself is, whilst it's great for the charity, it's not necessarily the proposition that the consumer is looking for. So we need to really think about the mix of retail and the mix of other propositions that we have there. Remind me what the first question was again.
It was just on the basis that, you know, online is seen as a kind of danger to a lot of businesses, but actually there is potential for it to be a kind of supporting factor. Sure. And I just wondered whether we'll move from, you know, if you order something on a well-known online ordering shop, it could be there the next day. There is now the capacity to order things and actually have them almost within an hour, 2 hours from a local supplier through certain delivery ways. Is that something that's an opportunity?
Sure, it is an opportunity, and often when I talk to retailers, there's a focus on what retailers call the cost to serve, and there's a bit of a mindset shift that I think retail also needs to make here, which is not only thinking about here and now, but how do we build new loyalty? How do we build customer lifetime value? How do we turn customers into fans? And unfortunately, we might not like the idea of having to continue to add all these new propositions that consumers are looking for, but the reality is there's demand for them. So to your point, we've seen this growth recently of what we call on-demand delivery, where there are all these new propositions like Gorillas and Get Here that are enabling the grocers primarily initially to fulfill from dark stores that consumers can't walk into, but they're using as fulfillment centres, and they're able to essentially deliver products within 15 minutes, half an hour or 40 minutes. And I don't think that's going away, but I do think that's an opportunity for local retailers as well. And the one thing that local retailers and many independents did incredibly well as, you know, some of the nationals, like Paul was talking about, you know, the importance of ScotMid, you know, during lockdowns, the local retailers became service providers. You know, they were able to help people who were housebound, who were isolating by delivering products, sometimes not charging them, just getting in their cars and taking them there because they saw that as an important part of what they had to do to support the local community. So, and as we continue to work from home, or we have this hybrid model, that also presents an opportunity for local retail as well. So I think the more we can do to encourage local independent retailers as well as the bigger national chains to offer that type of service, then I think consumers will engage with that. Sure.
Thank you very much.
Maggie Chapman, followed by Colin Beattie.
Thanks very much, Claire. Good morning to the panel. Thank you for joining us this morning. I've got a couple of questions, but firstly, just to follow up on the questioning that Jamie started there. I'm interested. You've all, in different ways, talked about the expectation as well as the need to diversify and not just focus on individual or certain elements of retail. You talked about hospitality, entertainment. I think there's also something around culture and leisure that comes into being able to pull in people into town centres, pull in and keep them there. I wondered. And maybe, Martin, I'll come to you on this, around the barriers to diversifying. What do you see in your experience? What do you see the blockages or the things that are stopping people using the bricks that they have in a whole range of different ways?
Very good point. I think that, you know, if you look at the actual model, the profit and loss model of a retail business, you know, you're limited to some extent to the hours that you're able to open. I can't remember the name of this business, but I did some high street videos in Colchester, of all places, in Essex, and there was a great little vintage store selling vintage wear, and they had they set aside part of the store. They will people in gone as well as listen to music, buy products. And then on a Friday night, they cleared the floor and they had a stage at the back and they had a band playing on a Friday night. So, you know, are our local authorities enabling retailers to, you know, have multi-purpose units? Because the more we can do with those environments, the more chance we have of encouraging people to spend more time there, to dwell, to come back for different reasons, but also to make them more profitable for the retail businesses, you know, that inhabit those spaces in the first place. So I think anything we can do at a local authority level to remove restrictions is one thing. I think the landlords obviously have had a big wake up over the last, you know, couple of years, realising that their traditional model probably wasn't going to be fit for purpose for the future. I still think there's a job there to do. And again, I'm not, similar to what David was saying, I'm not a planning expert, but I wonder if planning needs to be looked at in order to enable these spaces on our high streets to be more accessible to different brands in different sectors, be that entertainment, you know, food and beverage. You know, you need different planning consent, don't you, if you're opening up a restaurant versus opening up a retail store. So maybe there's an opportunity there to make that a little less onerous and a bit more attractive. But ultimately, a lot of it comes down to the cost. And if the cost is an issue, then obviously that's detrimental. So the more we can find ways of turning these environments into multi-purpose environments, they become more attractive to the people that hold the leases to whether it's a retailer, whether it's a restaurant. The more they can do with the space, the more profitable they can make it, the more attractive it's going to be, the quicker we'll fill these empty spaces.
Thanks very much, Martin. That's really helpful. I wonder if I could bring Paul in on this as well.
I'm not sure there's much I can add about diversification, though. If I can just pick up the point on online, because I think it's an important point from the previous question, just very briefly. At the Court Group, and I'm from the Court Group rather than Scott Mid, we've seen online grow significantly. I think 2 points. One, they can become, our stores have essentially become micro hubs. You know, we don't do dark stores. All our stuff that we deliver or is click and collect comes from those stores. So those stores become micro community hubs where people come and either collect the food or it's delivered from. That's the first point. And the second point is online growth does not necessarily mean reduction in physical stores. We've seen in a number of stores where we've launched the online platform, we've seen a 30% growth in those stores' revenues. We're not cannibalising our existing customers, we're adding new customers and giving, as Maxine and Martin said, that more omni-channel piece. On the cultural piece, the only thing I would say is that we know that in our stores that are in tourist hotspots and in cultural hotspots, they are very seasonal, and that we need to be able to match them and to be able to complement when those seasons are in. And, you know, certainly for the tourist stores that we have, we will double revenues during those seasons. And actually, one of the challenges we have increasingly is getting staff in to cover and colleagues in to cover those seasonal peaks. So it's not quite an answer to the question, but I just wanted to pick up. Apologies.
No, that's helpful. Thanks, Paul. If I can stay with you, Paul, changing tack a little bit, though, we've heard quite a lot about from witnesses and the work that we're pulling together on this, the tension between the pressure on margins and profitability and improving standards of fair work. And we know, you know, there's some horror stories around how hospitality workers and other workers have been treated. Can you give us any suggestions for how the public agencies, public bodies can support people in our town centres to support fair work and decent paying conditions?
So the Co-op Group is a big employer in Scotland. We employ almost 7,000 people. All of our colleagues get paid at least the Living Wage Foundation living wage. And I think there's something for government and civic society and public sector to celebrate and halo those businesses that invest in their colleagues. And we pay the Living Wage Foundation living wage. We've increased our wage levels for all our colleagues by 25% since 2018. And I think on top of a package, and I'm sure Maxine will say absolutely the same for a great company like Boots, alongside a package of low interest loans, high interest savings accounts, advances, etc. So I think there's something there about government celebrating and haloing those organisations that do the right thing, because a lot of this has got to be, particularly right now, food inflation gone up 5.9% the last period. It's got to be about the wages that we pay is one point. A couple of other points, if I might. I'm sure we'll come on to this. The opportunity to invest in those stores in town centres is really important. We know that we have a great example in Lockery, where we had a store that needed investment. We put the investment in and it's absolutely flown since. So the opportunity to invest really brings vibrancy to those town centres. I think the other point I would make is, and perhaps we'll come to this, is the role of local suppliers, because local suppliers can help to grow the economy. And as David said, ultimately this is an economic thing. We can grow the economy. And, you know, we've got a very broad range of local suppliers, from distillers to bakers to ambient goods. And I think, again, can government find a way to incentivise how we can use local suppliers? And we know that Scottish members and customers in particular are very keen on Scottish provenance for the goods that they buy. I think the central point, and I spent 20 years in government before I joined the court, Mr. Chapman. My view is that government needs to do more to celebrate and to halo and to point as a leading practice those businesses that invest in their colleagues and invest in their stores and invest in the communities in which they serve.
Thanks very much, Paul. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Colin Beattie to be followed by Gordon MacDonald.
Thank you, Convener. And at last we come to non-domestic rates. I'd like to know the witnesses' views on the non-domestic rate system. There are, and I would like a comment maybe on the benefits of the small business bonus, which obviously takes over 100,000 businesses out of the system and supports them. Are there reforms needed? What would these reforms look like? David, maybe I can bring you in first.
Sure. Thank you for that. And if I can just very quickly just pick up on the issue of fair work, and we're happy to put something in writing to the committee afterwards. So the vast majority of retailers subscribe to better paying conditions. ONS data suggests that in Scotland, retailers pay above the so-called real living wage. Now, admittedly, it's a little bit above. I think it's about £10 or just over. And I think I'm right in saying, in terms of the Scottish Government's business pledge, retail is either the fourth or fifth sector in terms of, out of, I think, 18 sectors and sort of being signatories, if you like, to both the pay issue and then all the other aspects that go along with that. But I think there's a couple of points I would just add on that, which is I think we need to have a more rounded debate about fair work. It's not just binary on the pay rate, because most retailers, particularly our members, offer a whole range of other benefits over and above that. And then also I think the other aspect of a more rounded debate is around the cost that employers have to pay on top, and we've seen a number of those increase in recent times. We've seen the introduction of the apprenticeship levy. Obviously, employers' national insurance contributions are going up this month. We've seen a couple of hikes in the statutory minimum pension as well over the last 3 or 4 years. In terms of business rates, small business bonus, we've supported that. It's a very helpful thing to many retailers, but also in terms of the wider debate, it's a sort of implicit and explicit recognition that cost is an issue for retailers as well. In terms of other things we think could be done in this space, obviously in our submission we've covered this. So, for example, as I said earlier on, business rates have been reinstated at a 23-year high. In terms of the poundage or the tax rate, that's over a fifth higher than it was at the beginning of the last decade. So we think there's an opportunity there. We appreciate there's a fiscal issue for the Finance Secretary if she does anything on that, but we think that's something that needs to be addressed going forward. And obviously, I think it was Maxine earlier on who talked about the higher property rate as well. So basically the long and short of it is that for retail premises and other types of businesses that are subject to the higher property rate, they're paying a slightly higher tax rate than they would do on comparable premises down south. And there are about, I think there are 12,000 businesses in Scotland or premises in Scotland liable for the higher property rate. A quarter of them are retail premises. So again, that's something I think the SNP government actually said they're looking to restore that level playing field by the end of this Parliament. It won't surprise you to learn we think they should go faster on that one as well. So, and that's something obviously that was brought up and raised by the Barclay Rates Review 4 or 5 years ago as well. I think they recommended it was in place by 2020.
Okay. Martin, would you like to comment on this? Bearing in mind that nobody likes to pay taxes, it's a question of how we collect the taxes, and bearing in mind central governments everywhere are under pressure themselves on their revenues.
Absolutely. I've got a couple of things. I want to address that quickly. So I think, again, it's a little bit like looking at how the landlords charge for their leases. I think that if we're going to charge a tax based on the property value, ultimately, which is kind of what the long and short of business rates, then I think what we do is we impede the opportunity for the reuse of those spaces by other retail categories. You know, we don't have a lot of big department stores anymore. So you could have a big store that could be repurposed, that could be selling a product at a much cheaper price point. It might be an independent business. It might be made up of lots of independent businesses. So I think we're stifling the opportunities to repurpose these stores by the current system. If we only tie it to the value of the property, we're going to make it far too onerous for smaller businesses to set up their business on the high street. Whereas if we find a way of tying it to what they're selling and the profitability and their sales, then we can create a fairer environment, I think, where those spaces can be used by a broader range of propositions and brands. If you don't mind, I would like to just very quickly address the Fair Work question, because I didn't get a chance to talk about that and I'm quite passionate about it. I started my career in retail 40 years ago. I know you'll be surprised to hear that because I only look 28. But I started my father's retail optical practices in and around Glasgow, studied Paisley and other places. Retail used to be a career. I don't believe retail for most people now who start on the shop floor is a career. And I think that one of the gaps is that we probably don't do enough to train and develop our people. I celebrate the Co-op and other brands who are paying people the right wages and everything, but I think we need to go further than that. Retail, when you enter a retail business, you could see there was a career ahead of you. You could see that you could succeed into other roles and that the business would take the time and effort and cost to invest in you. So I think rather than looking at things like the apprenticeship levy, how about we started putting money aside, be that from the retailer and be that at a governmental level, to actually encourage the learning and development of people in our retail businesses, so they start to see it as a career and not as something quite transient, which I think for most people today, that's what retail is.
Can I move to Maxine and ask her, how should non-domestic rates be reformed if that's the correct route to go? How would you see it? There's obviously difficulties in having a turnover tax in relation to retail. Equally, a lot of people would argue that a property-based tax of some form is still the fairest. So, Maxine, how would you see it go?
I think I'll start by saying I'm definitely not the expert on business rates. I think David's answer is probably more comprehensive than the one I'll give. However, I do kind of emphasise the point that I made earlier around large retailers being subject to the higher property supplement. Obviously, being a UK-wide business, that does mean that we have much higher rate bills in Scotland, and given that we have a number of properties that fall under that bracket, it does have an impact for us. I think we definitely welcomed the business rates relief that was provided during the pandemic, but the reversal of that just adds to the operating costs in our town centres that we've spoken quite passionately around how do we support our town centres. Overall, I think if we could just lower the burden rates and bring that higher supplement into parity with England, that would support our recovery. I have to say I'm not going to be the expert on what we should do instead of that, but that's definitely the thing that would have the biggest impact on us as a business. But David will has given a wider answer on retail as a whole.
Paul, do you want to quickly comment on that?
Thank you. Just 3 points, if I might. Number one, in the last 10 years, we've seen a 45% increase in real terms in our rates bill, our rates liability. So that's the first point. And as David said, that's not sustainable, I don't think. The second thing in terms of
UK
reforms,
or is it Scotland only?
Sorry?
Was that across the UK
Scotland.
or?
That's in so we've seen an increase across the UK. It's a slightly bigger increase in Scotland, and it's a 45% increase in Scotland in the last 10 years. Partly driven by the revaluation, because we have a lot of large stores. Partly driven by the lack of transitional relief. Second point is, you asked for reforms. I find it peculiar that, and I spent my 20 years in the UK civil service was in and around the Treasury for the most of it. I find it peculiar that the rate system penalises investments being made in stores. So, for example, if we put an ATM in a store, that increases our rates bill. If we put CCTV in a store to protect customers, and I've given evidence to committees on shop worker violence before in support of Daniel Johnson's bill, if we put CCTV in, that increases our rates bill. It seems peculiar to me that investments in store and in the assets of that community, which is that store is, attracts a greater rates bill. The third point I would make is we absolutely have to pay our fair share. I agree. What I would say, though, at the minute is there's a really uneven playing field between bricks and mortar businesses like us and Boots and others who are paying business rates and online sales on online businesses who are paying virtually nothing. There needs to be something about levelling that playing field between online and physical retail, which is why we welcome the idea of an online sales tax, which is hypothecated to reduce the business rates burden on physical retailers. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. I might actually bring in Alexander, as he is planning to ask about online sales. As Paul's mentioned it, we could do that just now.
Very good. Thank you, Convener. That very nicely led into the question I was going to ask in a second. One solution, as you mentioned, to plugging the gap for any reform in non-domestic rates and levelling up the retail playing field is a digital sales tax. I think, Paul, you mentioned that you've seen your online sales jump from 4 million to 200 million. I don't know whether you're able to share any detail on margins and profitability to give any idea of what scope there is on a digital sales tax. But I'd wonder if you'd like to expand on the prospect of an online sales tax. And also touch on maybe some of the problems that might arise in trying to implement it. You talked about click and collect, where obviously there's a crossover between people buying stuff online but collecting from physical stores. So, Paul, could I start with you and then Maxine?
We've certainly seen our online business increase rapidly since 2019. As you said, it's gone from 4 million to 200 million last year, and we expect it to grow further. I won't go into margins, etc., if you don't mind, in a public environment. What I would say, and particularly in Scotland, how that is fulfilled actually is quite varied. So in some places, we have Deliveroo and Golfer who do the last mile. Sometimes we do it ourselves. In our more remote communities, particularly in Scotland, it's often a delivery service by the cup. So there's lots of different mechanisms for that. In terms of an online sales tax, we aren't alone in this. There are a number of big retailers in Scotland across the UK who are in favour of an online sales tax that would have, again, as I said, I spent 20 years in and around the Treasury in London, so I've got some idea about how you construct a fiscal regime. You can have de minimis levels. You might want to exclude click and collect because it uses a physical building. There's ways that you can manage it. I think that's what the consultation that the Treasury in London are running at the minute is about. But I think there are ways that you can construct this that will enable a revenue neutral approach by raising money at a relatively low level, 2-3% on online sales in order to reduce a rates bill by probably by 20%. And what that would do is it would level the playing field between online and physical, number one. And number two, as importantly, and indeed the subject of this committee's inquiry, it will protect the physical town centres, which we have seen during COVID, and you'll have seen, you said the committee was in Dumfries, or the convener did last week, you'll have seen how important those physical communities are. Levelling that playing field will help protect those physical communities. So I understand the fiscal pressures that all governments are under. This could be done in a revenue neutral way by an online sales tax with de minimis levels and some exclusions to hypothecate a reduction in business rights. And as I said, the last point, it's not just a corporate group that are in support of that. There are a number of very big national retailers and Scottish retailers that are also in favour of that.
Thank you, Paul. Maxine?
Yeah, I think as Paul's just alluded to, there definitely is a need to recognise multi-channel businesses, and it's not one or the other. It's not bricks and mortar or online only. We certainly have similarly seen a drastic increase in our online sales. They have doubled versus what they were 2 years ago. They now represent 15% of our total sales. And we do expect that to continue, and certainly have seen the trend continue. Similarly, we do offer, or have started to offer in some locations, kind of within our delivery service through one of a partner to make sure that we are meeting consumer demand. But we do still see a need for that retail experience. So the future will definitely be omni-channel. I think in that context, any kind of debate really needs to be carefully considered on it. We would really only support an online sales tax if it did level the playing field. So if it did reduce the burden of taxation overall within the retail industry, we really not need to avoid a situation where multi-channel retailers have an increased burden, and instead look to commensurate business rates reductions. I think the other thing I would say is, as we do operate across the UK, our preference would be that there was a UK-wide decision, and we are currently engaging with the Treasury on that, just to assess the pros and cons of introducing an online sales tax.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
David, do you have any comment?
Yep, sure, thanks. And just, if I may, just to reel the film back slightly, I mean, in terms of the business rates system, as I understand it, there are a number of premises and sectors which are exempted from the rate system for very laudable, understandable reasons. And then to an earlier question, there are various rates reliefs as well. So as I understand it, actually, a minority of premises actually pay the majority of business rates. And I think the Barclay Rates Review actually had some statistics on this. In terms of a digital tax, actually the Lee Sparks-led review of the Town Centre's action plan actually talked about other parts of the economy which are going through profound change as well in terms of digital. So I think they made reference to things like Airbnb and Uber taxis and things like that. So retail's not the only sector going through that change, but we are in the process of collating member input and views on the Treasury's consultation. I think the closing date is the 20th of May. So we're bringing members together on that, and we'll be putting in a response. I've had a look at the consultation. There are 40 questions on the scope and the design and the potential impact of it. There's actually a heck of a lot involved in that. And in this day and age, ordering a coffee from a cafe online and going in to pick it up could conceivably be liable for these sorts of duties. And then there's all the whole range of issues around how that fits in at the moment, the cost of living. Just to pick up on where we are with that, my sense, and I say it's a bit early because we've yet to put in a full response, my sense is that there's a diversity of views within the industry on this issue. There isn't really a consensus. I'm very happy to share our submission with the committee once we've finalised it. Where there is alignment and consensus is on, property taxes need to be reduced. But I think the thing that strikes me about the Treasury consultation is there's very explicit tie in that to cutting business rates. But that's in England. As I understand it, any receipts, if the tax was brought in, the receipts from that would be Barnetized for the three devolved governments. And I've read the framework for tax from the Scottish Government. I've read the Town Centre's action plan that was published a couple of weeks ago, and there's no mention in there of what would happen to the receipts. And Paul obviously talked about it would need to be used to cut business rates. And I'm not any the wiser from reading those two documents as to what would happen with the receipts north of the border. I think I'm right in saying in the SNP manifesto there was reference to using the cash to support city centres and perhaps town centres. But I think it would be useful for this committee actually to try and get some clarity on that issue going forward. So if there was indeed a digital tax, would the revenues be committed to cutting business rates north of the border? And then there's another question, which is what would that reduction in business rates look like? Obviously, I'm guessing people like Paul and Maxine were quite keen that their firms and perhaps larger firms were to be the recipients of that. But I think that would be something very specific that the committee could actually, if I can be so bold, convener, could ask ministers about over the coming weeks.
Thank you. Thank you, convener.
Thank you. I'm now going to hand over to Gordon MacDonald. I think we're moving into this area of questioning.
Thanks very much, convener. I was wanting to ask about the how we tackle the blight of empty retail units. We've already identified one issue, which is absentee landlords. But Martin, you've already touched on some of the areas I want to ask about, which is commercial leases. What are the stumbling blocks within commercial leases that stop premises being brought back into use? And also about the town planning classification system, what changes need to happen to local development plans, etc. So if I could go over to you, Martin, first, and if you could highlight what we need to change within commercial leases. I know you've touched upon you would like to see turnover-related leases, but you know a lot of companies are tied into leases at the moment. So how do we unblock that situation so we can bring property back into use?
I think we need to look at shorter term leases. You know, I think we need to do what we can to encourage landlords to recognise that the days of being able to, you know, get somebody to commit for 10 or 20 years are gone. So how do we enable, you know, other retailers to have pop-ups, for example, to use the space for a temporary period of time, which we've seen the increase of now. So that's a great way of encouraging both larger businesses to take smaller format stores, but also to encourage independent retailers who historically might be reluctant to move from the 1 or 2 stores that they have because of the, you know, the onerous nature and the cost of taking on additional leases. We can make these spaces available on short-term lets and short-term leases, and landlords provide that flexibility. Then I think they will find that they will fill those spaces much quicker. They will be filled more readily and for longer periods of time. But as I say, it's helping them understand that the days of, you know, 10, 15, 20, 25-year leases are gone, in my opinion. So I think that's one thing. And I think, you know, again, I'm not massively close to the planning consent side of things, but I do think anything that can be done to ensure that essentially a space can be readily made accessible to a brand, whether it's a retailer, whether it's food and beverage. We've seen a big increase in gyms and fitness centres and well-being, health and well-being opening up on our high streets as well. So anything we can do to encourage these other sectors to take these spaces and to make it easier for them and to remove as much red tape as possible, which also helps the landlord make those spaces available, is going to be the way to go, because the quicker we fill them, the quicker we encourage people to come back to the high street. The problem is that what's happened in the last 5 years, you know, and you can see this in certain town centres where by the time you get more than 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 doors or spaces that are basically empty and vacant, all of a sudden people stop going to that part of the high street. And it becomes quite difficult and challenging then to convince them to come back. So it's really important that these empty spaces are filled and that we make it as easy as possible for the landlords to do that.
If I could bring in Maxine, Boots in recent years has closed a number of stores across the UK, and I'm just wondering what difficulties that has Boots has had in getting out of these leases. And you also talked about town planning needs to be more agile, and I'm just wondering if you could expand on what you meant.
Yeah, I think on the matter of closures, as any business would, we would constantly review the locations that we're in, and the leaseholds would definitely have a factor in that. And certainly we've seen changes within our consumers, both from a pharmacy and retail perspective. Certainly in Scotland, we haven't had a huge amount of closures, which is really encouraging. We've definitely been able to protect our businesses with some of the the things I talked about earlier, such as online shopping, warehouses, etc. Sorry, what was the second part of your question there?
And the evidence that Boots submitted that said town planning needs to be more agile, and I'm just wondering if you could expand on what you meant.
Essentially, it's the point I alluded to earlier, which is there is no one size fits all. Whilst we are almost represented in every town centre, but there needs to be a recognition that in some town centres, retail has already moved away from the town centre. So therefore, the out of town locations or the edge of town locations can be just as big a focal point. It's really how we are able to influence that on a local level. I think the other thing, again, I alluded to it earlier, is how we approach it in a diverse way. Certainly within our four walls, we tried to diversify. We are looking at different opportunities to become an anchor in the community. We've got the Ask Annie initiative. We have Macmillan support for cancer patients. We've got hygiene banks. So we've got lots of different reasons why people would come to us other than shopping. And I think how we can encourage more of that in our town centres and more of that understanding of perhaps third sector or different reasons to come in is really important.
Okay, thanks very much. And David, how do we change the planning system and the consent system for, I mean, I was looking at Edinburgh City Council and they've got over a dozen classifications. How do we encourage use of empty premises when we're in a situation where there is this long-winded and expensive process to go through?
Yeah, I must admit that the planning system isn't my area of expertise, but certainly anything, as Martin said, that can make it easier for businesses to trade and take up the opportunity to do so, the better. And as I say, we capture quarterly data on shop vacancies. And yes, the most recent figures covering the tail end of last year improved, but that was in the lead up to Christmas when there's more pop-up shops and all the rest of it. I guess I would go back to the point I made earlier on about building standards and building control, which is something I regularly hear from retailers around. Can we make it more flexible? Can we make it less time consuming to get those permissions and those consents and the building warrant in order to, get the store up and running as quickly as possible and generating revenues? And in terms of the planning system, it's perhaps one that's been raised with me less in recent years because there are retailers who are expanding their property footprint, but perhaps less so than there has been historically. We had that sort of race, space race as it was called, maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago. Those days have somewhat ended, but a system that's flexible and able to respond to changes is ultimately what we're looking for.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you. Fiona Hislop, followed by Michelle Thompson.
Thank you and good morning, everyone. I'm also interested in the buildings themselves and the use of the buildings. And we were very struck in Dumfries when we were there that it's a large town, but there was vacancies across the second and third floors of all the retail, whether they were filled or not. And if we want people to live and work in the town centres so they get a great experience as more customers because they're on the doorstep, how do we tackle those vacancies above the first floor? So maybe, Maxine, if I come to you first, what the experience of Boots has been for your stores, and what do you actually do with the properties in our towns that have second and third floors? Because just-in-time supply means that previously, if they've been used for storage, they don't need to be used for that. And what's preventing you from enabling them to become, for example, residential or used, because it might be in your interest now that they are used if you want people to live in town centres?
Yeah. I'd start by saying our properties are primarily leasehold, so it would be a landlord issue in most locations. However, I think I recognise within your question we do have overspaced retail units. Certainly, Dumfries, as an example, has 2 floors, and we do open both as retail units, but there is also large staff areas. But I think what we have done with our online business really brings that to life. So I can't remember who it was earlier that mentioned dark stores. We don't operate dark stores, but we do have online warehouses within some of our retail units. But that's within our own control. As I say, the biggest issue for us would be where we have adjacent properties above our units that are leasehold, and unfortunately they're out with our control. But certainly within our own estate, where we have the opportunity to, we have diversified into online warehousing, and we saw huge success on that.
And maybe, Martin, if you can think through the kind of implications of what we do with landlords that we can contact, absentee landlords, but also with leaseholds, and how do we, is there any kind of creative way of incentivising the use of the upper spaces that would actually benefit the retail underneath?
Well, I mean, I think from a retailer point of view, again, bearing in mind that what I said right at the get-go, which otherwise, if it's not, why do we go there? If it's more convenient because we're living there, fine. If it's more convenient to buy online, we'll buy online. So Maxine talked about the use of the stores for click and collect and using them as fulfilment centres is one thing, but let's make them more experiential. What could we do if I were Boots? Maybe I'd be thinking about, you know, creating events on the upper floor of the store. Maybe I'd clear away some of the floor space, and I'd have people in talking about health and well-being. And I'd encourage customers to actually come in and spend some time there and learn more about how they could improve, you know, their health and well-being through the vitamins and the supplements and all the other great products that Boots has to sell. So what can we do to actually turn these environments into something that we really want to go and spend time in? That's what I would be doing, because then you encourage people to come back, you encourage dwell time, and of course people spend when they're in there as well. And I think if landlords, I don't know what landlords can do to contribute to that, but they would certainly be interested in that. And even if it was a pop-up, if they thought that ultimately this was a concept that was going to encourage footfall and had a service-led proposition. I guess one other way of thinking about it is that, you know, traditionally retail was about selling stuff. And I think that in the future, it has to be much more about being a service provider as well as selling the products that we want to buy. So what can we wrap around products that we sell to make it a more holistic approach and more engaging experience for consumers?
Thank you. And to be fair to Maxine, she did explain the work Boots were doing with Macmillan and others for service provision. David, can I maybe ask you to kind of future think a bit about this as well? And I know businesses are so focused on running businesses. They've got a lot of pressure, especially the cost of living crisis can affect people coming in. But if we want our town centres in particular to be places that people will spend time in, is there something that can be done, particularly with landlords? Is there something that, obviously, your membership may have little influence in that, but they have an interest in that? So is there something collectively we could do to bring vibrancy back into our town centres above the first floor? And what is preventing your members from doing that?
Well, hopefully, I mean, so we talked earlier on about the various strategies that are out there, and at the heart of those strategies is this whole issue around collaboration between the public and the various private stakeholders. So hopefully that is something that will be taken forward. I mean, in terms of the retail strategy, they're going to set up an industry leadership group. I'm not across how that's going to be. I'm not fully across how that's going to be made up, and I'm not sure what the equivalent, if anything, is going to be in terms of town centres and city centres. But certainly we support more living above the shop, as it were, and using those spaces. I guess there's a broader question around what does that mean for public services? If there are more people living in our towns and city centres in terms of schools and GPs, does that actually help those survive and have sufficient customers, for want of a better phrase? Do we need additional capacity in terms of public services? And Martin talked there about, retailers themselves using these spaces, and obviously experience or events or theatre was something that was talked about just in the years leading up to COVID, and that's is one of the sort of the great hopes for the industry. It's been somewhat kiboshed by COVID and trying to avoid people coming together and all the rest of it. But certainly pre-COVID, I visited a well-known book retailer in Glasgow 2 or 3 weeks ago. They are restarting their programme. They've got upstairs space. They're restarting their programme of bringing authors in to do book talks and sort of music nights and stuff like that. There's a very prominent department store here in Edinburgh, which certainly pre-COVID did cinema nights. Who knew? So there's lots of these sorts of opportunities. So I think Martin's absolutely right. Businesses, just need to think sort of more holistically about that. But at the same time, you're also right in the sense that the travails of the last couple of years, trying to respond to the rules and regulations around COVID, how retail is changing, trying to grapple with all the pressures at the moment. I mean, the sort of one constant of the last few years has been this enormous disruption, this enormous change. That's been the constant for the industry from, on-off, Brexit, no deals, beast from the east, the rise of online, the COVID pandemic, now the cost of doing business crisis and the cost of living crunch. I mean, it's just been absolutely relentless. So to try and do more over and above providing, quality service, quality prices, is challenging, frankly, for most retailers. But if they can lift their eyes, if they've got the opportunity to lift their eyes a bit, then I'm sure they'll be up for taking up the ideas that Martin's articulated.
And just finally, on landlords and the relationship, obviously, of your members with landlords, and what is your overview of what landlords and investors in properties where your retailers may be obviously occupying? What do you think the pattern of that is likely to be going forward? Because clearly they might not be, if they're sitting on properties for a long time, thinking that they're going to come back to sell at a higher level in the future. That prospect perhaps is more diminished now than it's ever been. So what's your thinking about that? And what are your members telling you about that?
So one of the challenges early on during the sort of past 2 years has been, obviously, there were large swathes of the industry that were not able to open as part of the national effort to combat the COVID virus. So, we had a couple of Scotland-wide lockdowns. There was local lockdowns in West Central Scotland, and those were, tie-ins when a lot of retailers, so-called non-essential retailers, hopefully we don't go back to this sort of terminology, but there were shops that weren't able to trade and they're therefore open, they didn't have revenue, and obviously they looked to their landlords to delay or defer payment of their rents, let alone government in terms of the rate support. And actually the vast majority of the feedback we got from our members that landlords were up for those discussions. There were obviously some that were less keen on that. But actually, my understanding is that in the majority of cases, landlords have been flexible. Part of the challenge now, of course, is that retailers are having to pay back those rents that weren't paid during that time when they weren't able to trade. So the whole issue around the plethora of costs and cost pressures, whether that's taxes and regulation coming from government or supply chain pressures or commodity prices, that adds to the mix about how challenging it is at the moment. But as I understand it, the vast majority of landlords have been good to work with. They understand the pressures they've been facing the industry and want to get a good resolution at the end of the day. And I think there have been some changes at a UK level in terms of some of the processes around how you resolve some of the difficulties as well.
Johnson. Serendipity always comes around when I ask a question at the end, and a panellist inevitably leads on to the area I wanted to explore. And David, you've just done so, perhaps for yourself and Martin. I've been wondering, I've been listening to this because there's been so many different areas where we've touched on the kind of wider economic macro environment, which we are aware there's significant challenges. And it makes me think, and reading one of your blogs actually, Martin, in your site, where you're quoting the level, or I think you've taken it from Ruth Gregory actually, the level of consumer debt and how much that had risen in Q1 of this year. And it makes me wonder, so it's an open question perhaps to David and Martin initially, but if other panellists just want to finish off, have we as in terms of the terms of reference and scope of this inquiry, reflected enough on the challenges for consumers, given exactly what you say about the energy crisis, the cost of living crisis, Brexit is starting to really hit home now, wage depression and so on. So, because it's all very well having these grand ideas and reflecting the business owners, but if consumers don't have money to spend, we need to factor that in. So perhaps, Martin, I can see you nodding. Maybe you'd like to come in first since it was your blog.
Oh, it's a great point. I mean, obviously, yes, to all the points that David articulated there very well, you know, it's never been a harder time. And I think that, you know, whilst retailers are incredibly squeezed, you know, I think we all need to do everything we can to support people at this moment in time. And unfortunately, as is often the case, when times get tough, it's the people who are the least well off who are the hardest hit. So I think we do need to look at that, and I think we do need to address it. Interestingly, over the pandemic, we've never saved more money than we've ever saved previously, because many of us obviously weren't going into work, weren't going to the office, and some of that pattern of behaviour has continued with the kind of hybrid work from home model. So household savings have been significantly higher than they've ever been previously. But my instinct is at the moment, because of obviously the massive concern, not just the media hype, but the real concern in terms of the cost of living increases, energy costs, supply chain issues, and everything else, you know, people are squeezed and they are reluctant to tap into that. So I think there are certain pockets of society that probably got access to cash that will keep that for their emergencies and might well need it to pay their, you know, their fuel bills over the next year or two. And I think we do need to look at what, you know, everything that we can do to help, because at the end of the day, people need our help. And there's a lot of people marginalised in society right now who, you know, are below the breadline and can't afford to put food on their table. So what can we do to help them? And then what can retailers do? Give back to the neediest.
I suppose on that point, though, fiscal drag is going to kick in as well. And I suppose that's what I'm probing. Have we considered that enough in the visioning that we might choose to do around town centres? When you look, I mean, I agree with what you're saying about multi-unit flexibility and a move away from FRI leases and so on, but there's a cost associated with that flexibility for retailers, and quite often the business model that they may choose to adopt would be targeting a certain sector or a certain socio-economic profile. So I suppose I'm trying to kind of join the dots in the complexity of that and the cost, because that then represents a risk for retailers as well, where we've got these challenges for certain sectors of our society.
Sure. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And of course, there will be fiscal drag. And of course, the big unknown question, the million-dollar question that right now is for how long will we have that? And we don't know the answer to that. My instinct is, I mean, I think we are in this kind of, in my mind, it's a two-year cycle. So I don't really at the moment see an awful lot. I hate to be pessimistic, but I kind of feel that we're going to be in this probably until the end of next year. And that from 2024 onwards, I probably see a brighter time. But, you know, again, Ruth, a colleague on the retail think tank, I believe that they've forecast, you know, increases in interest rates up until October this year. So, of course, that automatically has a further knock-on effect, obviously, with consumers as well. I don't know that you necessarily would change what I was suggesting, because at the end of the day, we're going to come out of this. And I think the opportunity for anyone often is for retail businesses is in times of adversity. And I think there are a number of cases of retailers who pivoted really well during the pandemic, who had to fundamentally change their business model, who had to start to rethink what's the use of the store if we can't let people come in. You know, how do we make sure we can still use the store? And they started using the stores for fulfillment of products more locally. So I think retailers are very adept at adapting to the changes, but I think it's important that they put in place the building blocks now that make them, put them in a stronger position, if you like, for when we come out of this current economic crisis, however long that happens to last for.
David, any last comments or any other panellists just about are there things that we haven't had the chance to bring out today, given the economic crises across a range of areas that we're facing? Anything else that would just be useful for our purposes?
Yeah, I think there's a heck of a lot in that, if I may. So just to pick up a couple of things, I think I said early on that our data that we publish on retail sales in Scotland, last month for the first time was back up to pre-pandemic levels, but I then caveated that by saying there's a big question mark as to what demand will look like from consumers going forward. We also publish a shop price index each and every month, and shop prices are at their highest level for 11 years. They're up, I think it's 2.1%, which is quite modest compared to overall inflation, but obviously it's in the interests of retailers to try and keep down prices to attract customers in. And inflation, I think as Paul said earlier on, inflation is a touch higher when it comes to grocery retailing, just by the nature of it as well. So, yeah, there's a lot to. I'd probably err on the more optimistic side in the sense that at least retailers have the ability to trade at the moment. They haven't had for large swathes of the last couple of years, and as I think we've seen over the last couple of years, they're a pretty resilient and agile bunch. They're good at responding very, very quickly to not being able to trade and open their shops and getting online and finding new and innovative ways to reach their customers. So I'm pretty optimistic in that sense, but I think Martin's absolutely right. It's going to be another difficult period, and just like consumers have debts, then, as we talked about a moment ago, retailers are trying to pay back the rents that they have built up and accumulated over the last couple of years. There were various tax deferral schemes that they're having to pay back as well at the moment. There are COVID loan schemes, which have got fancy names, which I can't remember off the top of my head, which are also having to be paid back as well. So I guess I would round off with a plea to governments and parliaments here in Westminster, etc., just to say, give the industry a bit of a chance and a breathing space over the next couple of years as they try and recover and get back to some sort of health.
Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. David, if we have that issues have been raised right at the end of the meeting, if there's anything you would like to send to us additionally about the cost pressures coming from the pandemic, that would be helpful if you're able to do that. So I'll bring this session to a close. We're going to have a brief suspension before the next panel comes in. I'd like to thank the 4 panel members this morning for your contribution. That's very much appreciated, and I'll now suspend for a couple of seconds. May I now welcome our second panel this morning, Ruth Boyle, Policy and Policy Manager from Close the Gap, Joanne Cairns, Head of Research with USDO, and Brian Simpson, Industrial Organiser, Unite Hospitality. Welcome to the committee this morning. Can I ask members and witnesses to keep their answers short and concise as possible? If I maybe start with the first question, and if I address it to Joanne, if you would like to have a go, Joanne. Maybe outlining for us the impact of the pandemic on retail workers in particular, and how retail has changed in recent years. I might be also interested if you can maybe give us an idea of the size of the sector in Scotland. I think the Co-op group said they employ 7,000 workers in Scotland. So, Joanne, if you want to say a wee bit about what the sector looks like in Scotland, what the size is.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting us to give evidence today. Yes, so in terms of the retail sector in Scotland, it is, as has been recognised in the strategy from the Scottish Government, it's a very important employer in Scotland. 240,000 people work in retail in Scotland. It's the largest private sector employer, and it in particular employs large numbers of women and young people. USDO has around 40,000 members across Scotland. Vast majority of our members do work in either the retail sector or in a closely related sector, such as transport, distribution. So the future of the retail sector is obviously very, very important to our members, and the pandemic has had a big impact on our members pretty much wherever they work. For our members working in non-food retail, the impact of the pandemic in terms of lockdowns and the shift to online retail has had an impact on their job security in a number of cases. So, you'll be aware that we lost household names like Debenhams and Arcadia from the high streets in 2020 and 2021. In Scotland, there were 15 Debenhams stores closed, which led to around 700 direct job losses. But of course, those sort of anchor stores in town centres often make a contribution to footfall, so there's a wider impact. And figures from PricewaterhouseCoopers showed that 4 shops closed every day in Scotland in 2021, with a net loss of 751 stores during the year compared to a net loss the year before of 652, so that accelerated closures. So in terms of the impact on our members, a large number of our members continue to work throughout the pandemic because large numbers of them work in essential retail. So they were key workers working throughout. As you can imagine, that was extremely challenging and difficult for many of our members. And one of the worst aspects for our members was an increase in violence and abuse. So having to implement social distancing measures and face masks and sometimes having to deal with product shortages often led to customers taking out their frustrations on shop workers themselves. So that has been and continues to be a major challenge because it isn't solely pandemic related, although that did exacerbate it. There continues to be flashpoints for violence and abuse, particularly around things like age-related sales. So that is a continuing issue for our members.
Thank you, Joanne. Again, haven't you? Ruth, would you like to comment on this? And perhaps Joanne's referred to the job losses that have been within the sector due to the closure of some large stores. Could you maybe talk a bit about that and about changes we are seeing in the sector, about where we see a growth, what kind of jobs we're seeing a growth in and what areas we're maybe seeing reductions in?
Definitely. First of all, thank you very much for inviting Close the Gap to give evidence today. We're delighted to be here. I think as we heard in the session this morning, what the pandemic did was that it exacerbated pre-existing trends that were happening within the retail sector. We see this growth in online sales as a percentage of overall sales. We're also interested how the pandemic might interact with automation within the sector as well. I think Joanna's highlighted some of our concerns around an increase in harassment that was experienced by workers during the pandemic. I think other research by Ustall has also highlighted that there were issues for pregnant women and women on maternity leave in the sector during COVID. Research by Ustall found that there was a lack of understanding on the behalf of employers around pregnancy and maternity rights. There was a failure to conduct risk assessment for workers, and there was also a failure to find appropriate alternative work for workers. In terms of the structural shifts that COVID has exacerbated, online sales is obviously one of the pivotal ones. And what we see from a rise in online sales is that there's likely to be a decline in customer-facing roles, of which women account for the majority. So looking at the labour force survey data for September 2021, we see that women account for 64% of sales and retail assistants and 73% of retail cashiers and checkout operators. So these are roles that are on the shop floor interacting with customers. While these roles are likely to decline, we're likely to see an increase in new roles around logistics and fulfillment and technical roles associated with online retail. And these roles are more likely to be held by men. So in the longer term, what this could do would be to change the overall gender breakdown of the sector. So at present, we know that over 60% of the retail workforce is female, but over time that might change. But because of this changing nature of work in retail, what we really need to see is gender-sensitive upskilling and reskilling support for these women who are at risk of job disruption. So we need skills support to allow women to move into these high-growth jobs within the retail sector, also support for women who may have to leave the retail sector because of declining jobs. As Joanna outlined, we saw that there was the closure of prominent stores such as Debenhams in the Arcadia Group. And there were some retail stores closures that were anticipated, but the pandemic definitely sped up this process. And when we look at the loss of jobs that stemmed from Debenhams and Arcadia across the UK, we know that 25,000 jobs were lost in those stores alone. Now, estimates claim that around 80% of those jobs were held by women. So that means that the closure of those stores alone resulted in the loss of around 20,000 jobs for women. So again, this just underscores the point that women's jobs in retail are at disproportionate risk when we see this rise in prominence of online retail. And overall, just to say that I think that rising online retail is likely to create jobs for men, but result in job losses for women. On automation, the British Retail Consortium estimate that around 60% of jobs in retail are at risk of automation, and the ONS estimate that around 65% of retail cashier and checkout operator time could be automated. And again, these are jobs that are more likely to be done by women. And there's concerns that COVID may have increased the pace of automation in the retail sector, because when we look at automation historically, we see that it tends to happen in bursts, often in the waves of economic shocks. And in the context of the COVID crisis specifically, we see that consumer preferences may have changed. So as a result of social distancing and the fear of contracting the virus, but consumers may come to prefer automated services as opposed to face-to-face interactions for the foreseeable future. And what this means is that businesses now have an incentive to invest in new technologies that perhaps didn't exist before. I think as well, just to highlight that retail has a high outflow into unemployment. This has real implications for our employability and skills provision. We need to think specifically about how these policies and interventions are meeting women's needs. We know that generic interventions merely reinforce occupational segregation and women's disadvantage in the labour market. So when we know that women's employment in retail is at disproportionate risk because of these structural shifts and labour market changes, we need to make sure that our policies are meeting their needs. We also know that low-paid workers are more likely to be in work poverty, and indeed women across Scotland are more likely to experience in-work poverty than men. And because retail is low-paid work, these women who are experiencing job disruption are less likely to have savings to fall back on if they have a disruption to their working hours or their earnings. And that has implications for women's financial security, But also, given the close links between women's poverty and child poverty, this could have implications for Scotland's ability to meet their child poverty targets too. So I think COVID has just exacerbated pre-existing trends that were happening in the retail sector, and we're concerned because those trends are likely to hit women's employment the hardest.
Very much, Ruth. I'll bring Brian in now. Brian, if you had anything additional to say to that question, but can I also maybe ask, the previous panel did refer to the Retail Industry Leadership Group, which from, I think it was David talked about it in the first panel, I got the impression that the membership of that hasn't been decided yet, but I'd be interested if the unions had been approached or have any knowledge of the Retail Industry Leadership Group, or if you've been asked to be involved in that in any way.
Yeah, thanks, convener, and thanks for having Unite Hospitality here. It's a pleasure to be part of this evidence session. To my knowledge, Claire, and that knowledge may not be as deep as we would need it to be, we haven't been approached. Unite has not been approached to be part of that. I have to give a disclaimer that I'm representing, the hospitality sector. We've got 27,000 members across the hospitality sector. No, we haven't been approached to be part of that. Do you want me to talk about COVID and how that's affected the hospitality sector specifically on the back of that question?
If you would like to, if there's anything additional to what Joanne and Ruth have said, and it might be that the Industry Leadership Group is just at a really early stage and that nobody's been invited to take part yet, that's something the committee can follow up with. But if you would like to say anything about...
Just to demarcate the two sectors, though, I mean, obviously, retail, a lot of people do think about bars, restaurants, hotels, but for us, that is a very separate subsector within the Scottish economy. So the impact on hospitality has been very different for COVID. So just point out that I'm not just kind of repeating what the other panellists have said. So just looking at the impact, first and foremost, Forth, which is the most trusted data software in the industry, they estimate that the workforce in hospitality, so that is bars, restaurants, hotels, cafes, casinos, that they shrank by 26% between in 2020 and 2021. Now, across the UK, that would be 650,000 job losses. In Scotland, that would equate to 58,000 job losses. So it's not to, play top trumps about which industry's been affected worst, but hospitality undoubtedly has been massively affected. Similar to what Ruth and Joanne have been pointing out before, it's a sector which is pervasive with things like low pay. 60% of the industry is paid less than the real living wage. Continued precarity, 25% of the industry is on a 0-hour contract. That's 3 times the national average. And really that recruitment crisis that really started post-Brexit with the migrant workforce reduction has continued massively and exacerbated massively after COVID. We are seeing, on top of the cost of living crisis, a lot of workers just not even being able to make ends meet because they don't have the hours that they can rely on and they don't have the wage that they can rely on. But I'm conscious that we're short of time, convener, so I'll leave it there just now. But just to point out that we represent the kind of hospitality side of that retail sector.
That's helpful. Thank you, Brian. I'm going to move on to Fiona Hislop to be followed by Colin Beattie.
Thank you, and thank you to USDA and Unite members for what they did do during COVID. Your members will be very close to customers and will have a view, and indeed as part of any industry leadership, obviously they'd inform you as to what you think the sector itself will be like if we want to see vibrant town centres that have vibrant retail as well as hospitality. So I know other members will go into individual experiences for your members, but to give you an opportunity just now to talk about what you see as what the ingredients would be and how you see the future of town centres. So perhaps if I can come to you, Joanne, first, and then Brian. Joanne.
Sure. I think one of the lessons actually learned from the pandemic was the importance of retail in our communities, because those shops that were able to stay open and that needed to stay open, for many people, that was the only interaction that they had with anybody during the pandemic. And You know, I think that role of retail as a part of the community, a major employer in a lot of areas as well, and you know, improving intergenerational communication, reducing isolation, bringing communities together is extremely important. And I think that we need to have a town centre strategy and a retail strategy more generally that values the importance of face-to-face interaction. So I know that, you know, the supporting sort of experiential retail, also investing in customer service skills and investing in skills framework for retail workers, because often retail workers are sort of overlooked in terms of training opportunities and skills. So there needs to be more emphasis put on the importance of you know, actually dealing with a human, because we know that that's something that is still very important to a lot of people. You know, we know that as much as there has been an increase in online shopping, there are still many people who do prefer to deal with a human being and see somebody. 46% of customers want to shop on the high street rather than online, according to a study that Deloitte Digital Scotland released last year. And a quarter said that online shopping hasn't met their needs. So I think as much as it's important that we look at making our high streets vibrant, and we look at, you know, a future, how our high streets will look and how we'll use the space on our high streets, I think often the discussion around it sort of assumes that high street retail is, you know, is a lost cause, and that we should just look for new uses for our high streets. And actually, there is still a role for high street retail, and that needs to be at the centre of the retail strategy. And I just wanted to come back on the Retail Industry Leadership Group, just to say as well that my colleague Tracy Gilbert, who's our Scottish Regional Secretary, she's involved in the Retail Strategy Steering Group, and we, I think, as far as I'm aware, the membership of the Industry Leadership Group hasn't been confirmed yet, but we're hopeful that Usdaw will be involved, and we do think it's important to ensure that there's a worker voice in that.
Thank you, Joanna. Of course, it is a retail industry leadership group. Brian, obviously we've heard evidence that it's the experience of the town centres that matter, and obviously hospitality is the ultimate in terms of experience, I suspect. So if you want to give any views as to how you see that in the future to help our town centres in particular.
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. I heard quite positively from David and Martin before that, you know, bars, restaurants, cafes, they are central to a thriving town centre, essential to a thriving high street. And obviously what I'm going to say is that for a thriving high street to succeed, it needs to be sustainable. It needs to put money into the pockets of the workers, who, of course, are you know, customers themselves. But I was looking at the strategy, the retail strategy, you know, getting the right change means creating better jobs. So obviously, first and foremost, that means real living wage jobs. I'm pleased to hear that the Scottish Retail Consortium and representatives from the Co-op do support that Scottish Business Pledge. But really, in the policy response, we're being asked to look at how would we create a living and resilient town centre. I mean, first and foremost, we've got to pay them the real living wage. We've got to give these workers the security that they need. And by that, I mean contractual security. I made reference to just how insecure the hospitality industry is for workers. 25% of those workers don't know 1 week to the next how many hours they're going to get. They don't know. They can't plan. They can't get a lease on a tenancy agreement, let alone a mortgage, because they don't have secure contracts. So I would say, in order to have a thriving high street, in order to have a thriving town centre, we need living wage jobs that are given the security of guaranteed hours, but also with the sustainability that comes from, someone said it earlier, giving people promotional opportunities, that they see hospitality as a career and not simply as a job that you do in your 20s while you're at university and you move on to a career. We really want to make hospitality a career for people, and the best way to do that is for them to be able to make ends meet while doing that job.
And just finally, and sticking with you, Brian, unfortunately, we're seeing many hospitality venues saying that they can't open certain days because of shortage of staff. Now, that may be an opportunity to drive up wages, etc. But shortage of chefs or shortage of labour, and obviously we've had the impact of Brexit starting to impact there. Are you seeing any change more recently post-COVID?
Massively, Fiona. We surveyed over 600 chef members back in October last year. 48% of them said they had either left the industry or they were about to in the next few months. Now, if that were to come to fruition, which it probably has, 50% of chefs are leaving the industry. Those are the highest trained, or they take the longest to train. If 50% of chefs left the industry, it would collapse. What we're seeing post-Brexit and then post-COVID is a huge recruitment crisis. As you say, that is an opportunity to drive up wages, because frankly, the best way to incentivise these workers back, to attract the very best talent in the industry, is to pay them the wage that they deserve and give them the security of contract. What was the second element of your question, Fiona?
Well,
was it just on...
Well, I'm very conscious of time, so I'm happy with what you've provided there, Brian, and come back to the convener.
That's great. Thank you. Colin Beattie to be followed by Michelle Thompson.
Thank you, Convener. Let me take the opportunity to also pay tribute to the retail workers who worked so hard supporting us during COVID. I remember a few years ago, it must be 3 or 4 years ago now, this committee, or its predecessor committee, took evidence on a bill that was going through Parliament to support retail workers who were suffering harassment, mainly in convenience stores and so forth. And I think Joanne did touch on age-related harassment when she was speaking earlier on. And the idea was that by strengthening the support for retail workers in this way, that it would reduce the harassment that workers were encountering. How big an issue is this still? Has there been improvement? I realise there's been distortion through the COVID period, which might make it a wee bit difficult, but has there been a reduction in the harassment in the retail and hospitality sectors? And maybe I'll ask Joanne to come in first.
Thank you, and thanks for raising that issue, because as I said earlier, it's an extremely important issue for us. Following the introduction of the Protection of Workers Act in August last year, which was Daniel Johnson MSP's bill, which was a great step forward in terms of recognising the impact of abuse and violence against shop workers by making it a standalone offence. There has been almost 300 cases of abuse that were reported to the police in the first 3 months following the introduction of that new act. But we know that there is still a massive problem with underreporting because retail workers don't believe it will be taken seriously, and they don't believe there's this idea that it's part of the job, and that's something that we're really trying to make clear to customers and to staff, that violence and abuse is never acceptable. 90% of, according to our most recent survey on this, 90% of shop workers experienced verbal abuse at work last year. 64% were threatened by a customer, and 14% were physically assaulted. So it's still extremely prevalent, and there is still much more that needs to be done. But the Protection of Workers Act is an important step forward in that.
John, do you think, has the legislation had any impact on this?
Well, we haven't had the opportunity yet to assess that. So our survey results relate to 2021. So we're hoping to do some more survey work on that later in the year so that we can get a better picture of it.
Okay, Brian, maybe you'd like to comment on the hospitality sector.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. It's a really good question, because echo what Joanne's saying, second or maybe third to getting the right wage and getting security of contracts. The number 3 biggest issue for hospitality workers is the abuse that they've got to face, but it's not just verbal, not just physical, it's a lot of it's sexual harassment as well. We've done a similar survey of 1,200 of our women workers in bars and restaurants. 87% of them had experienced sexual harassment during the pandemic. We've launched a campaign called the Get Me Home Safely campaign, which primarily looks at getting workers home safe at night past 11 o'clock, past the last train or bus. We are currently trying to lobby local authorities to pass that, to ensure that the licensing objectives allow or encourage employers to pay for transport home, for example. We're pushing for proactive sexual harassment policies so that women and men are protected in the workplace from the moment they step in to the workplace, but also in order to get home safe at night. But yeah, it's a huge issue, and it will continue to be an issue. It's not just a COVID issue. It's something that will continue in an industry, frankly, that's fueled by alcohol and sexism within the industry. So yeah, it's still a big problem.
Ruth, is there anything that should be done to improve the situation in respect to harassment? Is there anything the Scottish Government should be doing more than it's doing now?
Yeah, I'm glad that Brian raised the issue of sexual harassment. At Close the Gap, we have a particular interest in the experience of sexual harassment of women working in retail and hospitality settings. There was a 2019 survey by Ustall that found that 70% of women who were working in retail had experienced sexual harassment at work. And this is concerning because sexual harassment is a form of violence against women. It's a violation of women's human rights and their health and safety protections, and it's also a contributing factor to the gender pay gap. I think that there are things that both the Scottish Government and employers can be doing better. As Joanne highlighted, 2/3 of workers who had experienced sexual harassment at work didn't report it to their employer. And this points to negative employment practice around understanding what constitutes sexual harassment and how you should respond to disclosures. So in terms of what retail employers could be doing, similarly to what Brian outlined, we've called for employers to develop and implement a robust sexual harassment policy that recognises the gendered experiences of sexual harassment. And they should also be taking practical steps to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace. So this may involve things like building capacity in line managers so they understand sexual harassment and that they can appropriately respond to disclosures. Also around awareness raising about what is sexual harassment in the workplace. And we need this because we know there's higher rates of sexual harassment in workplaces where nothing is done, because it signifies that this behaviour is normalised and that it will be tolerated. In terms of actions for the Scottish Government, I think that what's been outlined already, that the Protection of Workers Act will help to protect some workers in certain settings. However, what we also need is the reinstatement of protection from third-party sexual harassment in the Equalities Act. Now, the UK Government have committed to doing this, but there's no timescales for that work. So I think there's a clear role for the Scottish Government in working closely with the UK Government to make sure that that happens on a timely basis. I hope that we'll come on to talk about the retail strategy in a bit more detail, but I think as well there's more that could be done around harassment and in particular sexual harassment within some of the initiatives that are announced within that strategy. So how will sexual harassment form a core aspect of the Fair Work Agreement, for example, and the wider Fair Work employer support tools that will support the implementation of that retail strategy? This is a very prevalent issue, and I think it's really important that we're taking that forward as we implement the retail strategy.
Thank you. I'm going to bring Jimmy Halcrow-Johnson in for a supplementary.
Thanks very much, Convener. It's a very quick question to Joanne. You talked about the protection of workers, the number of cases that have been forwarded. I think you said 300. I was wondering how many of those, what the outcomes of those had been, how many convictions there were, or whether they've kind of progressed enough.
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't have any further information on that. This was a report that was published by Scottish Business Resilience Foundation, I believe, and it didn't go into detail about convictions, but that's certainly something we're going to be following up on and watching closely.
Michelle Thompson.
Good morning, panel. Nice to see you all. Perhaps following on from what we've been discussing around sexual harassment and therefore looking more at the gender pay gap, which we've had some insight into your introductions. But I suppose what I'd like to understand a bit more, because we can all see there's a lot of work being done in this. You know, the Scottish Government, a kind of fairer Scotland Gender Pay Gap Action Plan and so on. But I am interested to understand what more practical solutions can be made, and specifically by the Scottish Government, bearing in mind that there are systemic issues, particularly prevalent in retail and hospitality, and I think we all understand that. Give us your bright ideas, in other words, of things that the Scottish Government can do as compared to those areas where we need to rely on the UK Government. Oh, sorry, I should have said, perhaps, Ruth, you'd like to go first.
Yes, of course. I think, first of all, we always ground our analysis and what can be done on the gender pay gap in the fact that the majority of the causes of the gender pay gap are not unlawful. They therefore sit outside of the remit of employment law. So there's a number of things that the Scottish Government can do that are currently within the powers of the Scottish Government to enact immediately. We're very pleased with the publication of the first ever Gender Pay Gap Action Plan, and I think that really highlights the commitment to taking action on the Gender Pay Gap Action Plan, on the gender pay gap in Scotland, sorry. However, I think that plan is continuing to have to do a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of how we're prioritising action on the gender pay gap. If we look at the retail strategy, it links to the gender pay gap. However, there aren't any specific actions within that plan that are explicitly designed to promote fair work for women. And I think merely linking to the Gender Pay Gap Action Plan is not always the most effective approach, because we know that when gender is not explicit within the context of a plan, it's rarely prioritised within implementation. So if we think about the retail strategy specifically, there's a number of implementation groups and delivery agencies that will be taking forward the actions that are within that plan. However, if they're to look at the document itself, because gender equality is not necessarily a core aspect of the outlined interventions and actions, it won't be immediately apparent to them that gender equality is something that they should be considering within implementation. And just to return to the earlier point on the industry leadership group, I think it would be really positive if there was gender competence on that group and also the presence of equality organisations. Because when we look at the retail strategy so far, we're unclear how equalities organisations have been involved in that strategy. In terms of practical policies that the Scottish Government can do, I think fair work is a key aspect of this work, and we're very supportive of the Scottish Government's continued focus on fair work in Scotland. However, we recently responded to the consultation on becoming a Fair Work Nation, and the main takeaway from our consultation response is that the Fair Work policy framework needs to be better gendered if it is to deliver fair work for women. So we'd like to see more prominence being applied to flexible working as a core aspect of fair work, sexual harassment, as I've already outlined, and also thinking about gender-sensitive training and upskilling initiatives. We have this continued reliance on pre-existing interventions like the Flexible Workforce Development Fund, individual training accounts, and modern apprenticeships. However, the design of these programmes is not well gendered, and that means it merely reinforces women's inequality in the labour market. A key aspect of all of this is adopting gender mainstreaming approaches throughout all policy development. Now, this is a tool to proactively embed gender considerations into the process of policy making, and it's required by the public sector equality duty. However, we don't yet see that being a consistent part of Scottish Government or local authority policy making. And as a result, we get this gender-blind policy making that doesn't take account of the differential needs of men and women. A tool of gender mainstreaming is a quality impact assessment, although, as I'm sure the committee have heard on numerous occasions, we're concerned about the quality of equality impact assessment in Scotland, and also we see these being done later and later in the policy process, where the potential for that equality impact assessment to actually influence policy direction is very minimal. So I think changing the nature of policy making is a really important starting point. And then thinking about the gendered barriers that exist to fair work is a second point. And that involves looking at women's lives, understanding how they're more likely to be primary caregivers or have multiple caring responsibilities, How does that enable them to involve themselves in training or to access employability programs, for example, and just understanding the realities of women's lives and how that influences their input into the labour market?
You've given a huge amount of information there, and I think you've actually been very clear. Can I assume, just to close, that everything that you've said is more than applicable to retail and hospitality, which arguably as a sector is symptomatic of all the issues, both in systemic terms and policy terms, that you outline? Last wee question, because I'm quite aware of time for everyone else. The convener is looking at me warningly. So everything you've said, I think, applies to retail and hospitality, you know, a multitude of times over. Can you just confirm that for the record?
Yes, definitely. We see patterns of occupational segregation being very acute within the retail sector. It's female dominated. We know that women in retail have less access to training. We see that work in retail is increasingly precarious, and this contributes to women's overall higher rates of in-work poverty and wider inequality in the labour market. So yes, absolutely, these issues are particularly applicable to the retail sector.
Thank you,
Keith. Thank you. Colin Smith, to be followed by Maggie Chapman.
Thanks very much, Convener, and good morning to the panel. Can I kick off by asking Joanne about the Scottish Government's recent retail strategy, which highlighted the example of ScotMid and USDA working together. Maybe, Joanne, you could say a little bit about what that involved and how we can ensure that other retailers and pub chains and food and drink providers can follow this particular example.
Yeah, thank you. USDA is recognised by ScotMid for collective bargaining purposes, so we negotiate paying conditions for members there, as we do with various other major employers, including Co-op Group, Tesco, Sainsbury's, and Morrison's. So we have, in terms of our relationship with ScotMid, I know my colleague in Scotland, Tracy Gilbert, has been involved with them in discussion in dealing with issues around violence at work as well, and we have regular consultations with company about changes to the business, and I think what we would like to see come through the Fair Work Agreement is a stronger emphasis on the importance of worker voice and engagement and the role that trade unions can play in that, and the benefits to both workers and employers of doing that. So we hope that as the Fair Work Agreement is developed, that will be an important theme in it. And can I just apologise for any background noise, because there's some drilling going on outside my office. It's quite noisy, so apologies if that's coming through on your end.
It's the nature of online meetings. We're used to lots. Just a follow-up, Joanne. I mean, a lot of the evidence we've had so far highlights the fact that the future of our high streets may well mean fewer big retailers, a lot more smaller independent shops, and of course, growing online sales. Can I ask, what does this mean for trade unions when it comes to, first of all, organising, and I suppose recruiting almost, and supporting the fair work practices that obviously are important to the union?
Yeah, well, I think, in a number of cases that there's job changes within the agreements where we already organise. So, for example, in supermarkets, we've seen perhaps, more use of online, on .com orders. So we have more members working as sort of .com pickers and things like that. So where we already have agreements that cover all those roles and they're still in store or in distribution centres where we organise, then there isn't that can just mean that we continue to organise those groups of workers. We know that often with the increase in online deliveries, there's greater use of the gig economy, and which is much more difficult to organise, and where often those sectors are not unionised and are not, where there are poor working practices involved. So there are concerns there, and I think there are also concerns which Ruth alluded to earlier about the impact in terms of women's jobs being lost in retail, and the shift in employment becoming away from women as automation increases.
Just in terms of that wider, we're told the strength of the high street in the future will be those smaller independent shops. I mean, how successful are the union in terms of trying to organise within there, where you don't have, I suppose, big head offices to contact that have multiple chains across the country?
Yeah, I mean, it can be quite difficult to organise in those smaller retailers, and equally it can be difficult to organise in bigger retailers when you're trying to gain recognition, because the process for getting statutory recognition is quite arduous and difficult. So it's not so much, it's not that organising in because the retail sector is changing all of the time, but we have in those sort of emerging retailers such as B&M Bargains, we have recognition now, and we're seeking recognition in Aldi and Lidl. So I know those are big retailers, but they're retailers that weren't around, so much a few years ago. And we're always looking to organise workers wherever they are, but often people working in small employers don't know that they have the right to be a member of a union, even if the union isn't recognised. So I think it's quite important that people are aware of their union rights, their right to be represented at work, even if they do work for a small employer, and that's something that perhaps the Scottish Government could do some more work around.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Jack. Can I bring Brian in on similar points? Brian, obviously you mentioned the impact of the pandemic on the hospitality sector and job losses at a time where supporting fair work has probably never been more important. Can I ask to what extent is both the impact from the pandemic but also the changing face of our high street having on trade union representation and obviously that fight for fair work? Is it making it more challenging for you when it comes to organising in workplaces?
It's certainly challenging, Colin. The last 2 years have been really difficult to organise workers. But if there is an upside to the pandemic in terms of organising, it's been that we've been able to adapt to online organising. So, for example, a very large hotel chain that shall remain nameless just now, when they tried to terminate 95% of their workforce, we very quickly got those workers onto Zoom calls, onto WhatsApp groups, and we organised them virtually. We wouldn't have been able to do that, ironically, had we not been in a pandemic and we'd had to go to those workplaces. We'd had to actually meet those workers face to face because, frankly, as Joanne's already pointed out, it's very difficult. Some employers do not recognise unions, and in some cases don't recognise the legal right to be in unions. So we have many instances of where we've not been allowed to even enter hospitality workplaces. So the upside, if there is one, to organising in the pandemic is that we've been able to adapt really quickly to organising. And I should say, we do organise gig economy workers. Unite is the union, for example, for Deliveroo and Uber Eats delivery riders. We've got quite a few hundred across the country who've been able to successfully organise despite the kind of disparate nature of the job. In that sense, technology or the remote nature of the job has actually helped in that organising because they've been able to organise each other virtually rather than having to meet in person.
Is there anything from a policy point of view at Scottish Government level that would enable the strengthening of that organising?
Yeah, I mean, we've given evidence to local authorities, to this committee, to talk about things like the Union Modernisation Fund, which Unite Hospitality was one of the central focuses of the Union Modernisation Fund. The Scottish Government has been incredibly supportive of making sure that fair work is not just a tick box exercise in terms of procurement. It is actually about reaching out to new workers, migrant workers, young women, workers who have never been in a trade union before, and saying to them, look, a union isn't just about going on strike, it's about driving up standards, it's about ensuring that you get treated fairly in the workplace. In terms of what can be done, there's still a lot that can be done. As I said earlier, the Licensing Scotland Act, we believe, needs to be changed, for example, to put a bit more pressure on employers to ensure that they embed the Fair Work agenda into everything that they do. So, for example, a liquor licence, we believe, should not be given to a late night venue unless they pay the real living wage, unless they ensure that workers are given safe and free transport home after the last bus or train. It's very simple, and I don't think that costly requirements that would actually transform people's lives.
Okay, thank you, Maggie Chapman.
Thanks very much, Claire. Following on from Colin's line of questioning around support for trade unions and the work that trade unions are able to do, I was very pleased to be able to spend a little bit of time at STUC Congress in Aberdeen yesterday, and one of the sections of debate was very clearly on improving workers' conditions, employment rights, and improving recognition and support for trade unions. Brian, I wonder if I could come to you first on this. One of the challenges I think that we have is because employment law is not completely devolved. We've got voluntary schemes like the Campaign for the Real Living Wage, like the Scottish Business Pledge. Are these voluntary schemes actually delivering for workers? And if not, within the constraints of devolved powers, what more should we be looking at doing to make sure that all employers actually take workers' pay and conditions seriously, but perhaps particularly the hospitality workers that you've spoken about this morning?
Thanks, Maggie. I think it's the most important question of all, frankly, because it's about how policy can actually deliver for working people. And there is a lot that can be done on a local, regional and national basis to ensure that fair work is actually implemented. So to just give one example in terms of procurement, we know that hundreds of millions of pounds are spent. A lot of that is in the hospitality and retail sector and public money that's being spent. Yes, we do what we can, or the government does what it can to ensure that the real living wage is paid, to ensure that zero hours contracts are not used. But we are seeing that down the supply chain, that just isn't happening. There are a lot of workers down the supply chain of procurement who are not given guaranteed hours, who are not, in some cases are being paid age discriminatory rates. They're not even being paid the national minimum wage, they're being paid below that. But there's a lot that can be done. I think, Maggie, to be quite honest, naming and shaming those employers who receive public funds who don't, for example, close the gender pay gap, who continue to use zero-hour contracts or low-hour contracts, because, of course, getting 10 hours a week can sometimes be just as bad as getting no hours at all. But specifically on sexual harassment, again, we have lobbied for 10 years to get the third-party harassment effectively reinstated into the Equality Act. The Scottish Government can be making firmer statements, I think, to say, look, if you want public money, you should be implementing proactive sexual harassment policies. You should be providing safe and free transport home after the last bus or train or tram. These shouldn't just be add-ons at the end. They should be prerequisites. They should be requirements for them to be able to, for example, get a liquor licence, for them to be able to receive public money. So I think just on that, and keeping it as short and sweet as possible, but just to support what Ruth said earlier, equality impact assessments as requirements on the employers, they're not high quality enough. We need to almost be making them a prerequisite for these contracts. And as I say, if those employers continue over 2 or 3 years to fail to close the gender pay gap or the migrant worker gap, they should be held to account and named and shamed.
Thanks very much, Brian. Joanne, could I bring you in on the same question?
Yeah, I wanted to point out one area where the Scottish Government does have powers, which it hasn't exercised, which was on New Year's trading. So Usdor's been campaigning for a longer break for retail workers at Christmas and New Year. And the legislation on Christmas Day trading does allow the Scottish Government to require large shops to close on New Year's Day. And there was a consultation last year following campaigning from our members. And 94% of the people who responded to that consultation supported shops closing on New Year's Day. It may seem like quite a minor thing, but it's something that's really important to our members. And so we were really disappointed that after all of that process, that ministers didn't agree to make the change to the law that we were asking for, because we don't think it's much to ask for retail workers to get an extra day off for New Year. So I think that's just an example of one of those areas where the Scottish Government actually could do something and so far hasn't done so.
Okay, thanks very much. I'll leave it there, Claire.
Thank you. I would like to thank all the 3 witnesses this morning for the evidence they've given us and their contribution to the inquiry. If there's anything you felt you weren't able to share with us this morning, you're free to send in a written response as well, in addition to the evidence we've received this morning. I will now close this part of the meeting.